I will present the technological study conducted with my colleagues Pascal Roumégou and Laura Resina on 3 sculptures of Pablo Picasso. This study was realized within a research partnership between the Fundación Almin y Bernard Ruiz Picasso Faba and the Museo Picasso Málaga. Both Faba and Museo Picasso Málaga have in common some of their missions. Among them are the study, research, and dissemination of the work of Pablo Picasso. The close relationship between the two institutions is reflected in a periodic 3-year long-term loan. The occasion of the current long-term loan, started in 2020, was a privileged opportunity to bring together the conditions necessary for the joint observation of 3 of the plaster sculptures belonging to Faba. While the majority of the Pablo Picasso plaster sculptures had been in the past the subject of former publications addressing, among other things, the technical aspects of the artist's practice, the close observation of the Faba plaster collection has raised several questions that led to define the main objectives of our research. The first one was to identify precisely the plaster modeling and casting techniques used by the artist. The second one was to determine the nature of the surface layers visible on many plaster sculptures, identified by default as insulating surfaces. And the aim was to provide elements to clarify, when possible, the known material history of the sculptures, specifically in relation with their bronze casting process. And finally, the presence of seam lines on the surface of one of them, namely the crouching cat, led us to question the denomination original plaster. We wanted therefore to define if this sculpture was rather a cast or a direct plaster. Regarding methodology, we used digital microscopy, UV lighting observation, X-ray imagery, and qualitative analysis when that was possible. We also interviewed molders, and specifically one of the last gelatin molders workshop in Paris area, and investigated Museo Picasso Paris archives as well as private archives. The objectives detailed in the previous slide led us to select the following 3 sculptures. It's important to note at this stage that they all have been casted in bronze and that the woman who leaves doesn't belong to the same period and production context than the 2 cats, as we'll see later. So starting with the woman with leaves, we can introduce it saying that this artwork was produced in Boisgelou in 1934, at a time when Picasso intensely practiced direct plaster modeling and also initiated a series on impression taking. The artist had assigned one of the garages of the castle outbuildings to this use. He produced one of his most important sculpted ensembles here, including in particular the 4 woman heads, some of which we can see on the picture on the left. So those different views highlight the aspect of the surface layer surface. We can notice that the layer is matte, though locally glowy, translucent, and has a brownish aspect. Regarding the structure, we were surprised to note on the X-ray imagery the absence in the lower part of an internal metal stem, as is nevertheless usually the custom. Several technical details indicate instead that the dress was modeled upstream. What I call the dress is the base. Was modeled before and then integrated into the rectangular base, as we will see on further slides. But only a thin wire twisted on itself is perceptible at the junction area between the base and the dress. And it has been introduced there before the plaster was completely set as a structural anchoring element between the base in poured plaster and the dress added. And the bubbles visible on the surface indicate that the plaster was used for the base in a liquid, almost liquid consistency. In the upper part, however, Picasso uses a metallic armature that he positioned to accommodate the modeled volumes of the arm and the leaves. At the same time as placing the arm in a structure, the artist modeled the neck by adding a plaster of rather firm consistency. At this period in Boisgelou, the artist now works on the series and the imprint. The author, Werner Spies, expresses the extensive use of both processes using the following formula, I quote, "Picasso systematically uses mechanical means next to new plastic shapes modeled. Directly modeled parts are incidental in comparison," close the quote. So therefore, part of our methodology was to test in the workshop different molding techniques to understand which could have been used by the artist. And on the left, we can see Pascal's Roumégous plaster test using modeled plaster compressed in a corrugated cardboard. The photos on the right show a second kind of mechanical mill employed by the artist, namely here, leaves molding. The aim of our tests was to identify which possible technique allowed the maximum imprint quality. As you can see, it's very sharp, and in the artwork, of course, and while retaining the dynamism of the initial leaf curvature. A thin layer of plaster, liquid, and that's the photos on the top. A thin layer of plaster liquid was applied to a fresh leaf, which was made possible to restore its finest vein while maintaining its natural shape. After the first layer of imprint has hardened, the leaf was strong enough to receive a thicker layer of plaster without deforming, and that's the photo on the top right. So we see that Picasso takes advantage of all the possibilities offered by the material. Regarding our second question related to the nature of the surface layer, we didn't proceed to surface sample on this artwork because those were destructive. So we simply used observations under various lighting, including UV, and compared them with the same residues collected on the other artworks, which were qualitatively analyzed, and the residues are identified as gelatin. And why is it consistent to find gelatin on a plaster sculpture surface? Because the gelatin was used since the 19th century in the making of the molds, and it was used for the casting of the works within the bronze casting operation. And another element belonging to the bronze casting process are the cavities found at the angles underneath the base. An example is shown on the photo on the right. Their purpose was to maintain the artwork during the bronze casting process. As this sculpture has been casted, it's most likely that the plaster has received surface layer as a separating agent. Still, it's not possible to determine to what extent this layer may have had also an aesthetic function or have been modified by the artist himself. So to sum up, the research highlighted the use of a plaster molded separately and implemented as a structural base without a traditional metal stem, the incorporation of the molds themselves in the final artwork, and the traces of gelatin on the surface, which is consistent with the material history of the work and in particular with its bronze casting. The artwork having been molded for its bronze cast, it's likely that the plaster received a layer of separating agent. Those layers were applied to prepare the objects during the casting process in order to avoid adherence between the mold and the cast. The original, the model. Now we can see the second sculpture studied, the cat. Comparatively with the woman with leaves, the cat was modeled as the crouching cat a few years later, so in the early 40s, when Picasso had already taken over the Grands Augustins studio. And it's precisely in the bathroom transformed into a sculpture studio that Picasso modeled in plaster a number of artworks from this period. The photo on the left, taken by Dorama in 1941, shows actually both cats. We can see on the right side the crouching cat that we will talk later. On these detailed views, we can notice that the surface layer has a matte, translucent, and brownish aspect. And regarding the structure, the masses were mounted around metallical twisted stems of various sections visible on the X-ray images. The legs were mounted around the stems with plaster reinforced with tow, which fibers are noticeable at various places on the surface. And we can see a detail on the photo on the right. We notice perceptible tool marks on the surface, which reflect the artist's technique in the fresh plaster. There he proceeds by eliminating the plaster, not by adding. That's the photo in the middle. Coming back to the surface layer covering all the surface, its qualitative analysis indicates that it is constituted of oil with traces of shellac. Those substances are commonly listed in manual and historical molders' books. The analysis of the brown residue, localized with the blue arrow, before, the surface layer I was talking about is the one which is in the red circle. And now, the analysis of the brown residues localized with the blue arrow indicates that it is gelatin. The presence of this material residues on the surface is explained again by its probable use as a molding material. As the sculpture has been casted, the brownish layer most likely be considered again as a separating agent. However, it's not possible to determine the potentially intervention of the artist there. So, or to discard it, actually. We can sum up the main points, saying that the gelatin residues are again trapped on the surface hollows, and together with cavities under the base, their presence is consistent with the casting operation, which is documented to have been done by Robecki's foundry in 1942. The surface layer is constituted of nut oil with a bit of shellac, which are again materials commonly used by molders. It's most probable that this layer could be linked with the casting operation. The crouching cat now, so the third one, as we've seen previously, the crouching cat was created in the early 40s at the Grands Augustins studio. As we can see in this photo from Bruxelles on the left side, it is, yes, we can see it just in this photo, and it's nearby L'Homme au Mouton, which is in the middle. And we notice on this photograph from 2020, so, excuse me, we see on the photo on the left that the tail was not already broken, but we know by archive sources that the tail was broken just a few years later its creation. So most probably not very late after this photo. And Brassai in particular, who was the photographer who closely documented the artist's production and life, reported this event. The plaster surface itself shows significant difference with the two former sculptures. The network of seams visible on the surface, as well as the multiple casting bubbles, with a concave profile, indicate that this is a cast and not an artwork directly modeled in plaster. The surface layer is quite different as well here. It is thick, glowy. It is a thick, glowy, and bright layer. And the analysis shows that it is made of linseed oil with shellac, substances again commonly listed in manual and historical books to be used as surface insulating agents by molders. And we can see the network of we don't see it really well on this picture, but it's highlighted by the red arrows. The comparison between the two first photos, so the one on the left and the one on the middle, reveals several surface differences. The black and white photo on the left is a Brassailles cliché of the model sculpture taken in 1943. Now, if we focus on the cavities circled in red, we can note that they show a different aspect on the old and recent photos. The cavity surface appear more closed on the recent photos, which is in the middle. And this is due to a casting default when taking the undercut impression of the cavities in this area. Moreover, we notice more generally that the edges in the photo on the middle are less sharp and the reliefs are blunter on the sculpture, and the reliefs are blunter. And those elements indicate that the studied cat in the middle is a plaster cast of the original model cat visible on Brassailles cliché. The X-ray images show an area of regular thickness in the perimeter of the artwork where the material appears more dense. And also note the stems with a straight profile which differs from the twisted one seen before. And those were stems usually used also to strengthen plaster casts. Finally, the comparison between the plaster casts and the bronze from Museo Picasso Paris, which was casted by Valsouani Foundry, makes it possible to note an interesting point. On the left photo, a double incision is noticeable on the tail. That type of mark was made by molders in order to position the pieces if necessary during the casting process. It's visible also in the bronze cast on the right, and the lac was filled on the intermediary works and on the bronze. And this is most probable that Valsouani used this plaster cast for the bronze itself. So, excuse me, the seam lines network, as well as specifically concave shape bubbles, indicate that this is a plaster cast. Nevertheless, it's not clear if this plaster cast is the cast mentioned in Robecki's Foundry archives of 1942. What is most probable is that this plaster cast was used by Valsouani's foundry, so it's another foundry, to cast the bronze years later, probably in 1943. And the surface layer, which is made out of linseed oil and shellac, again, is clearly a surface layer made to isolate the artwork during the casting process. As it is applied on the cast itself, it's most possible to rely the surface layer to a molder's intervention. To conclude, we can say that the use of plaster separately molded and employed as a structural element, as well as a non-traditional use of the metallic armature, are some of the elements highlighted in this research for some artworks, some of the plaster cast, or some of the plaster sculptures, excuse me. This type of implementation requiring both a rapid execution and an agent acting as a consolidating agent. We also wondered about the use by the artist of a setting retarder, having had both functions. Many substances known for having these properties are listed in recipe books. And among them is the animal glue, for example, which was largely used in this purpose in molders and workshops. Some traces of animal glue were found in our plaster samples. However, it could be as well a pollution from the gelatin of the molds. So therefore, at this stage, we consider this presence as a first indication for further investigations. And finally, various residues found on the surface, as well as the characteristic adjustments to prepare the artworks for casting, allow to relate those sculptures with the process of the bronze casting. And I will rapidly finish saying that further comparisons with other Picasso plaster sculptures are necessary to help discriminate these points. More generally, additional investigation on other Picasso plaster sculptures would be useful to document the creative process of the artist and or the molder's intervention, and they might as well complete the current investigations on the bronze casts. The global comprehension of direct plaster technology, casting, and surface layers, the discrimination of one from the other, together with the understanding of substances associated, is really essential to apprehend the plaster sculptures and to help establishing the appropriate conservation strategies for our sculpture collections. Thank you very much for your attention.